Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh weekly webinar. It's Monday night at 7 o'clock, so good to see everyone involved in our series of webinars. And this one specifically focusing again on training, optimising training through the COVID pandemic. It's been a challenging few months. And it's brought a lot of challenges, not just to clinical service delivery, but also to training. And very much tonight, we're going to think about what we can do and what aspects we need to consider to optimise training. Very much having the trainees at the heart of this. And we do have a trainee with us tonight. I'd like to introduce Gregory Ekata, who's a general surgical trainee in the southeast of Scotland. But he's on an out-of programme for a year, doing a Scottish clinical training, Scottish Clinical Leadership Fellowship, so really getting involved. He's been partnered partly as a host at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, but also in Scottish Government, so he's been right at the heart of a lot of what's been happening associated with the pandemic. We've also got David Large. David will be well known to many of the trauma and orthopaedic surgeons, previous TPD for trauma and orthopaedics in the west of Scotland. He's been chair of the Trauma and Orthopaedics SAC and has also been the clinical lead for the e-logbook. So a wealth of experience there. We have also Bill Allum tonight. Great to have Bill, consultant surgeon at the Royal Marsden Hospital, past chair of JCST and currently chair of the Academy of Medical Royal College's Flexibility Working Group. So really involved for a long time in surgical training with an oversight, again, across all specialties, and even broader now, working with the Academy, thinking of how to make training flexible for the trainees of today. And also Tim Graham, Member of Council, Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, but currently Head of School, West Midlands, and also Chair of COPS, Confederation of Postgraduate Heads of School of Surgery. So it's great to have Tim, and I'm on Rowan Parks as Vice President of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, also Acting Medical Director of NHS Education for Scotland. So hopefully we've got quite a spread from trainees to trainers to those who are actively trying to do what is best for surgical training. But we want to hear tonight your questions as we look at some of the challenges, but try and think of some of the solutions to optimise surgical training. We're going to have a couple of presentations, first of all, to get everybody thinking and to perhaps touch on some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and then open it up for questions and to hear your questions, and we'll explain how to do that later on. But I'm going to hand over now, first of all, to David Large to give the first short presentation, and then following that will be Bill Allum. But first of all, David, can we ask you to share your thoughts?
Well, good evening, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Rowan. I've been asked to talk to you this evening about how the logbook can be used to assess the damage of the current pandemic, and also how it could be used to plan the recovery. Perhaps, and it's maybe not the ideal way to start a presentation, I should start it with a bit of a health warning, because in using logbook data to look at figures across the country, we're actually using the logbook for a purpose that it wasn't designed. The logbook is essentially a collection of individual logbooks, and therefore if an operation is carried out with maybe 3 different logbook users present, it potentially could appear on the logbook database 3 times. On the other side, not everybody who's actually present in an operation will actually use the logbook. Not everybody is up to date, and also there is the issue of unbundling, where a procedure can be broken down into component parts and can appear as a variety of different things in the logbook. But as they say in the Carlsberg ads, it's probably the best data that we have. But it does therefore necessarily come with a bit of a health warning. And if you see figures on the slide or things that you don't understand, then there may be all sorts of reasons behind them. That said, however, I'm going to do my best using T&O as an example, but hopefully there will be parallels with all the other specialties to try and give you an idea of what the impact has been on surgical training through the current pandemic, and try and give you an idea of whether or not you might reasonably achieve the CCT guidelines at the end of your training, or whether or not you are going to need extra training, all of which, of course, is dependent on, to a certain extent, how long it will take us to return to normal, or in fact, if you're a pessimist, will we ever return to normal at all? So I think to answer those questions, you have to have an idea of what normal training should look like in numbers. And a few years ago, when I was programme director in the west of Scotland, I undertook what was basically a very tedious manual task for a variety of trainees who had all reached the end of 6 years higher surgical training in the west of Scotland without interruption by anything, and plotted in 6-month blocks their rate of gain of surgical experience. I was interested because I thought perhaps that trainees would gain experience more rapidly towards the end of their training, but as you can see here, this selection of trainees, they're all basically straight lines with a few little changes in the gradient of the line. But I think the thing that struck me most looking at these was quite a significant degree of variability. If you look at the trainee in the top left here, they gained in 6 years almost 3,000 operations. On the other hand, another trainee here who just scraped over the bar at just over 1,800 operations. The only difference, the only thing one might point out about this individual, he managed somehow or other to get a lot more elective experience. I know who that individual is. I did ask them how they managed to achieve such a good figure, but we never really found an answer to it. And I suspect that there are probably personality traits, people pushing a little bit harder in some areas, that will lead to a graph like that. Perhaps somebody a little bit more reserved might get a slightly slower rate of acquisition. But the majority are probably like those two graphs in the middle at the top and the bottom left-hand corner, which are basically fairly similar. And if you look at these in detail, I know any of you who are T&O trainees will be holding your hands up in horror that this is the old T&O CCT indicator procedures, but this was a slide I prepared a number of years ago, and it's a very tedious one to produce, and it's just for one trainee. But you can see that, broadly speaking, there might be a slight upswing towards the end as people chase targets, but most of the experience is gathered in a fairly linear manner, with the odd place. I mean, this one here is knee arthroscopy, no experience gained there, perhaps because it was a hand surgery job. But again, broadly linear. And then again, if you look at things like the total number of emergencies, total amount of elective, and the amount of surgery that's actually being performed, it's all remarkably linear. So the question then, having given you an idea of what normal training looks like, is to ask, how badly has your training been affected? Now, literally last week, and actually as late as Friday afternoon, I got an Excel spreadsheet from the logbook, which contained data of every operation done in for T&O in the two 6-month periods from December 2018 through to May 2019, and then again from December 2019 through to May 2020. And you can see the gold line at the top represents the volume of T&O cases in that earlier period, and then Why it should be so much lower generally in 2019, 2020, it's a bit difficult to answer. Maybe a slight drop-off in the latter months, as maybe there were fewer trainees present in individual cases, the roads being a bit quieter during lockdown, but not, to be honest, a huge difference in the volume of trauma surgery. However, the very dramatic and not entirely surprising difference if you look at the volume of elective surgery, and that's obviously what we're most concerned about in T&O. But if you look at the other specialties, there will be similar differences, you might say, in general surgery, that the amount of sort of elective hernia repair or varicose vein surgery would be following a similar trend to elective orthopedic surgery. And to try and put that into a little bit of perspective, you can see perhaps there's been a drop from around about 9,500 operations per month to really virtually zero. So let's just say it's a drop of 9,000 procedures per month. There are roughly, and this is a back of the envelope calculation, 900 T&O trainees in the whole of the UK. So that loss represents, on average, around about 10 elective cases per month. It's just to give you an idea of the ballpark. Another thing that I looked at in this very short period of time that I've had to look at this data is, does it really matter where you work? Well, I don't think it really comes as any surprise that actually it doesn't matter whether you're in a major trauma unit, a DGH, or a large combined unit. The trends in the graphs for trauma look much about the same. And likewise, if you look at the pattern of elective surgery, every single type of unit, the volume of elective surgery has absolutely flatlined since about March of this year. So quite a significant impact. So how is this going to affect you all as individuals? Well, I think if you look back to the graphs that I showed on the individual trainees who'd reached CCT, it will obviously depend who you are. If you are like the trainee in the top left, then perhaps you've got a little bit less to worry about. If you're the trainee who was on the far right of that slide, then maybe you would be a little bit more concerned. It will also depend to a certain extent on where you are in your training. If you're in ST8, you're probably fairly close to the end of your training and will almost certainly have achieved the majority of your targets, and therefore it's not likely to be a major concern. Similarly, if you're in ST3, well, it's clearly very frustrating to be losing out on operative experience. You have got a huge amount of surgical training ahead of you, during which time you have a good opportunity to recover. And it also depends to a certain extent on what type of placement you're doing. If you've lost out on a hand surgery, and I do apologize for using orthopedic examples, but there will be equivalent examples in other specialties, but where the hand surgery, a lot of high volume, you will have lost perhaps a lot of total numbers, and that'll be, and therefore you will be above that average of 10 procedures in a month, and therefore it'll take you a bit longer to catch up. And obviously also training programs vary in how busy they are, the volumes of experience going through their hospitals, and therefore, again, it will depend to a certain extent on where you are. And obviously, you need to bear in mind your own individual CCT guidelines, because we're talking here maybe that if this current pandemic and the effects that it has on the provision of healthcare last 9 months, you might be 90 elective cases down on average. But bear in mind that over 6 years in trauma and orthopedics, you're expecting to average around about 150 cases every 6 months. So you can, from those mathematics, you can get a little bit of an idea of how badly you will be affected. So what can be done about it? Well, there is a report which I suspect is perhaps not as well utilised as it could be in the logbook, called the Trainer Report. It's available to consultant trainers and it's available to programme directors. And here I'm just showing a graph. It's the number of total knee replacements done by individual consultant trainers on the y-axis and their percentage of supervision on the x-axis. And clearly, if you have, as a trainee, have ended up the current pandemic with a significant deficit, say in total knee replacement, then you clearly want to be, if you can see my mouse pointer, I'm not sure, you want to be working with one or other of those two people at the top right-hand side of the graph. That data is all available to program directors. But I would say, I'm just going to finish off, therefore, with one example of a trainee who was on my program when I was program director. This is their experience gained in 6-month blocks throughout their training. And you can see that the majority of those bars are well above the average of 150 procedures in 6 months. And therefore, this was a good trainee who was making good progress. But they had a problem with this particular job here, where there were just definite unidentified rota issues with that jobs, which had a huge impact on their experience. This individual then decided to try the other side of medical care and spent 6 weeks in ITU as a patient and 3 months on sick leave, which had a fairly disastrous effect on the experience in that 6 months. And certainly in the west of Scotland, we give our paediatric experience through an attachment at a pure children's hospital, where the numbers will look wonderful if you work there in the summer, pulling a lot of children's wrist fractures straight. But if it's the winter, well, in Scotland, there's never any snow or ice, so the numbers can be pretty low. And you can see, therefore, with these 3 blocks, this trainee was basically lost out in about 250 procedures that they might otherwise have gained. Yet with one carefully targeted block, and I suspect, not that I would ever advocate this, the European working time regulations were torn up or quietly ignored, but at the end of it, this individual ended up meeting all their targets by being short of a couple of cases in one indicator and one in another, which was really nothing that you could do about. So message that I'm putting out is that this might not be as bad in the long run as it appears to be, and that I think for the majority of people that it will be fairly recoverable. But anyway, that's all I have to say. I hope that was of some interest to you, and I can hand it back to Rowan and await any questions.
David, thank you very much for that. Absolutely fascinating data, and it just shows the power of data to be able to reflect, but to see really what is potentially a sizable issue, but ending on a note of optimism, which is great to hear. No doubt we'll come back to you. I should say, for those on the call, that David isn't really on a beach in Antigua. He's in the west of Scotland, and it's absolutely pouring there, so it's very wet and windy, just in case you were jealous. So David, thank you. For those on the call, what we'd love is to get your questions. I'm sure that stimulated some questions. We've got Gregory on the panel. He'll no doubt come up with some, but please go to the bottom panel, along the bottom of your screen, and under Q&A, and please start posting your questions, because we'll need these to try and challenge our panel to come up with some ideas and solutions. So if you've got either comments to make or questions to raise, please add them to the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to good friend and colleague Bill Allum, and Bill's going to bring a next presentation on improving flexibility and transferability in postgraduate medical education and training. So Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Rowan. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk about a piece of work that obviously started pre-COVID, but it will, I think, give some insight into opportunities that may be available, certainly in the first 12 months, and will be being rolled out across training, not only surgical, but across postgraduate training into the future because of the approach towards flexibility. Next slide, please. This work all came about following the industrial action in 2016. And in some of the discussions that were had at that time, it was obvious that trainees were not happy with the fact that they were having to go through essentially a continuous process without the opportunity to stand and think and to take stock. And the GMC produced the blue document on the left of your screen, which very much looked at how there should be adaptation to postgraduate training in the context of a lot of the comments that came through during the discussions, particularly with the arbitration services. And one of these key issues was regard to have flexibility. Trainees wanted to have far better control of the trajectory of their progress through training than they had hitherto. At the same time, or just before then, the Academy had produced the document on the right, the pink one, where there was the opportunity in some specialties to transfer from specialty to specialty, taking with you skills that you'd already learned. This had worked certainly, for example, in general practice, where individuals could take skills in, for example, pediatrics, emergency medicine, psychiatry, with them as they moved into a general practice specialty rotation. So the next slide, please. As a consequence, the GMC challenged the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges to look at the so-called ATCF in the context of adapting for the future, to try and find out what was common, and if we could bring the ATCF up to date in the context of developments with GMC standards around new curricula. And this was particularly emphasising the role of flexibility opportunities for trainees, as I say, to have more impact on the way in which they progress their career through to CCT. There was no doubt that there were some issues with regard to understanding about what was available, and the challenge from the GMC to the Academy was to try to make people far more aware that it would be possible to make these moves and to look at how you could train in a more flexible environment. Next slide, please. Flexibility is really gaining momentum. It's in the NHS long-term plan. It fits across the whole of all members of the workforce, and that's not just medically qualified ones. And it means that there's a number of opportunities here which we're trying to exploit, which means that trainees can have some time to think what direction they wish to take their career. And this can be, it is intended for this to be not only in the early years, where indeed some people will certainly make the decision, I wish to do this specialty, and will go into it and stay in it all the way through. They have no doubts. It's not uncommon for the surgical view to pursue this line of training, but there are others who are not quite sure of the direction of travel. And although run-through is a bonus in certain specialties, there's no doubt that some trainees get into one specialty and think, actually, this isn't quite the right thing for me. Can I look at changing the specialty that I'm currently working in? One of the keys here is the generic professional capabilities, which the GMC produced a couple of years ago, which has a series of domains, the key ones being professional values and behaviour and professional knowledge. And particularly for the early years, as any doctor post-foundation is developing their career and their professional skills, they would wish to see that these skills, they can learn and get credit for them, and then they can take those with them when they eventually go into a training program. And so the idea principally here is to get the credit for the skills you've gained so you do not have to repeat them were you to change specialty. Next slide, please. So this ability to take time out of training, the ability to change specialties, is something that was being very much argued in those discussions around the industrial action. And it fits with the shape of training document, which was advocating a much more flexible workforce who had a more general training rather than getting too siloed into specialist areas of activities, because that fitted much better with the assessment of patients as they come into hospital, be they elective or emergency, with their breadth of health needs. And it was important that in addition to having those opportunities, that it was important that doctors were given the opportunity during their training to make the most of their work-life balance. Everybody has slightly different approaches and has different pressures, be they at home, with their career trajectory, and it's important that those are addressed. And these were key issues as far as the GMC were concerned that we needed to address. Next slide, please. So the working group was convened, which I had the pleasure to chair. It was multi-specialty, but it also involved the statutory education bodies of HE and NES, members of the GMC, so full college representation. And we've come up with two main groups. There's those in training, first of all, and this is this group of doctors who may have gone into initial phase of a specialty, who feel it's not the one for them, and they want to move into another one. And the key here is to be able to take the skills that they've gained with them without them having to be reassessed or relearned, as it were. So in other words, wasting time as they join the new specialty. And the second group is the group who are in training but wish to take some time out. Now, you know that there are already out-of-program groupings, be it for other training, excuse me, or research, or indeed experience. Now, the current regulations in the Gold Guide state that if you go out of program purely for experience, what you gain during that time cannot be recognised when you come back into training because it's not in an environment that is approved for training. What has been developed is what's been called out of program pause, where trainees can take time out of their training program, undertake possibly some additional clinical experience, or indeed, as our trainee on the panel has done, to go into something involved with administration, education and management. And then after a period of time, usually about 12 months, they have the opportunity to return into program. And the key, however, is that the discussions we've had with the GMC is that those skills can then be assessed when they come back into training to be included as part of their requirements as they progress through program towards their CCT. Next slide, please. There's also another group, which I think is very important, and it's not just those in training that we're interested in. There is no doubt that there's a significant proportion, particularly in the early years, of trainees who do not, having finished foundation, go straight into a program. They work in trust jobs, health board jobs, providing service. They're not quite sure the direction they wish to go. They may well take part in a number of different specialties, a mixture of rotations, be it in a craft or a non-craft specialty. And the key here is to get them to record that experience such that when they then do join a program, that can be recognised. There is no doubt there's a large number of doctors who are working in trust posts who've been in those trust posts for a long time, and they may wish to join a training program. And indeed, again, with them, we're looking at the potential for those skill sets being recognised when they join a program. And similarly, in the same context, those in the SAS grade may wish to do the same thing. Now, there are some specific issues with regard to these two groups, which we are having to look at. So that's the next main phase of our work, because the first two groups in training, that work is ongoing. Next slide, please. What we're doing is when they come into program or join a program is to do what's called a gap analysis. And a gap analysis is designed to identify the sets of skills that the individual has gained, that there's evidence to back that up from the assessments they've had, even if out of a training program from their appraisal process, and to see how that maps against the expectations of the year of training they are either going to start with or are joining because it's perceived they've certainly gained a set of skills already. They get a careful review by the TPD or equivalent, and the learning agreement is then designed to make up for the skills that we're missing from the gap analysis. In a way, this is actually not dissimilar to what David's shown you, whereby there's a concentration as you go back into a program to regain the skills that you may not have had or to make up for the skills you lost for other reasons. Next slide, please. And this is where I think we are when it comes to the implications of this approach, which will be rolling out in the future across all of postgraduate training, but particularly relevant to the post-COVID time. We published the document from the Academy, and there's an introduction published already about how to change specialties with FAQs. But the key is this out-of-program pilot. there's no doubt that many trainees in surgery have been redeployed. They've missed out on opportunities, a bit like David's shown you. And so by developing the type of gap analysis that I've shown you, it's intended that trainees will have the opportunity to plan their learning agreement with their program director. Now, it may well be that they need to consolidate their experience. And within this program, opportunities are going to be made available to trainees from August the 1st to enable them to take time out of program, working in an environment that's not in training as such, but to gain service skills, which can then be reassessed when they come back into program. In parallel with this, there is now the opportunity to have periods of less than full-time training for up to 3 months, largely, and both this, the less than full-time training and also the out-of-program work, largely to enable folk to catch up, gain some time, some thinking time. They may well not be on a full-time contract, but it means that they can get over, hopefully, any of the unpleasant experiences they've had with COVID. No doubt will be tired and trying to regain some of those skills that they have felt they have missed out on. And so it's designed deliberately to try and get round some of these issues where we know people have missed out on training opportunities during COVID. Now, this will roll out into the future, and already in anaesthetics and in a couple of other specialties, there are trainees already out of program who are consolidating their skills, taking stock of where they are, and they will come back in. And I think this is going to be a great benefit to enable a trainee to determine their trajectory of travel as they go through their training program. I'll stop there, Rowan. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill, indeed. And really a lot going on that was very much started pre-COVID, but could be really relevant, I think, at this time. A lot of trainees have been working exceptionally hard, and it's just opening up the opportunities and options available to them. So I think that's good to reflect on, and no doubt some of the trainees on the call might have a call about what it might look like in practice, so we can revisit that. It's great to see quite a number of questions, really good questions coming in. We're going to start coming to those shortly. But perhaps before we could do that, I just asked Gregory to bring the trainee perspective into that. You've heard a couple of very interesting talks, Gregory, and I'm sure it makes sense and there's resonance to what you and your colleagues will be feeling at this time in terms of missed opportunities and what we do about that. But have you any thoughts, any reflections on what you've heard, or any other questions that you want us to start thinking about on the panel this evening?
Thank you very much, Rowan, and thanks to David and Bill for those excellent talks. I think by way of, I do have a number of questions, but I'll come to that later. By way of reflection, I think for lots of trainees, myself included, there is significant anxiety around this time in terms of, as has been alluded to in some of the questions, practical steps that we can use to make up the lost time that you describe. There will be trainees at different points in their training program, SC3 versus SC7s, but there'll also be those of us coming back from out of program experiences who in pre-COVID times would have the first few months to rattle through a number of cases and get those skills back, which we will be affected by this. And I guess as a surgical community, it is up to us as trainees to search for those opportunities to maximize our training, whatever training we have left. But I think it's also important that trainers play a key part in helping trainees through this post-COVID era, which leads me to one of my first questions, and I'll just say to David, first of all, I think the trainer report that you highlighted was excellent, and it's certainly something that I didn't know about, but I wonder if there is a way that this is made available to trainees, and Rowan, you might have a view on this as well, particularly trainees that are rotating to training environments that they've not been at before, where you don't really know what trainers to attach yourself to, etc. So having that level of detail trainer comparison will certainly be of benefit. The the second question is more around, in the recovery phase, how we as a surgical community and trainers in particular balance service provision versus training opportunities, because there'll certainly be a lot of waiting lists, expansion, and obviously the priorities from a service management point of view will be around service provision and getting through cases, and how we balance that with the training opportunities. I'll stop there and I can ask some more questions later.
Excellent. Thanks, Gregory. Well, let's deal with some of those questions now before I go to Tim for some of his reflections. But visibility of the trainer report, David, you made mention to it, and I know, Bill, you've had a lot of input to ISCP over the years in your JCST role. But David, that visibility of the trainer report and trainees being able to, I guess, look at data, I guess they'll know by word of mouth where the high volume units are in their regions and their locality. But is there a way that they can influence their future track, their pathway, their rotation that maximises where they see needs in their operative logbook? David?
Well, I certainly have no objections to using logbook data to try and drive up the performance of trainers and to trainees. And certainly one of the things, we are working on a big rewrite of the logbook at the moment, and I've actually spent quite a lot of time over the last few days looking at how one could reformat reports to inform this, so that trainers know, well, actually I'm below the national average in the amount of supervision that I'm giving them, or I'm above the national average in terms of how much assisting my trainees do, and that might encourage a degree of reflection. If I saw that I was above average in the percentage of my trainees were assisting, then I would probably wish to do something about it. I don't personally have any issues with that being in the public domain. Certainly, if you in terms of putting information into the public domain, the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland have done a huge amount with logbook data, putting it into the public domain, letting trainees see where their hospitals are in terms of their training performance. I think it's perhaps more in terms of hospitals that they've done it rather than individual trainers. And that would probably be similar to what I remember Tim and I were discussing. Cardiac surgery statistics are probably better reported at unit level rather than individual level. We're not quite there at the moment, and I think, but I absolutely agree it's the right direction to go. It has a huge potential for improving training and trainer performance in terms of training.
Yeah. Bill, any comments from ISCP viewpoint?
I think, and indeed one of the questions that's cropped up I would support, is that we have to be slightly careful about numbers. I'm as guilty as many to use numbers as a indicator of the level of experience an individual gets, but we are moving much more to competence capability-based training, and people do gain those skills at varying rates, and I think that has to be borne in mind. And the point about quality of training is crucial. That I think the problem at the moment, and this is where we have this discussion that's a difficult one with our service providers, in that they're stuck with having to number crunch to catch up on the backlog. And I think that there are potential opportunities which are being explored. There's no doubt that prior to COVID, there was the use of independent sector, whereby the more straightforward ASA1 cases were being done. They're primed cases for training, and there should be absolutely no bar to a trainee who's NHS employed working on NHS patients with their NHS consultant. There should be no problem from the indemnity point of view, and those should be opportunities that should be promoted. And these are things that are being looked at to try and get round some of the issues, the obvious ones, whereby we've got a backlog. The only way to turn these around is to get trainers to do them, and that's to the detriment of training. The answer actually is no. There is perfect opportunity, bags and bags of literature. Okay, the younger Trainees may take longer to do procedures under supervision, but that has to be built in. There's evidence that actually more senior trainees can do it just as well in perhaps the same sort of time as the boss. I mean, unfortunately, one of the practical issues is PPE turnaround time, which is going to have a net effect on what we're doing. And I think that's not going to go away. PPE, we're going to have to learn to live with that, and we've got to adapt our training approaches accordingly. So although, yes, what David's shown us is extremely useful, it has to be shared very carefully with all the stakeholders. And I think that's where some of the work that's going on between the education bodies and employers to make it, and the colleges in particular, are pushing the employers to make sure training is not left on the back burner ahead of service provision.
Okay, thanks, Bill. There's a lot in that, and some of the themes starting to pick up that we'll come back to in the questions. Before we go to those, Tim, any reflections? You've heard quite a bit. Some of the challenges as a head of school, somebody who understands the service challenges and the training needs. Any reflections on the questions and comments so far? You're on mute. Sorry, Tim.
First of all, David and Bill's presentations were excellent and are really contemporary and up to date and very helpful. I've picked up quite a lot from both of them. I think from a School of Surgery perspective, some reflections really for the trainees particularly. The principles that we're trying to work to at the moment is that there should be minimal disruption to the trainees due to the COVID pandemic. But there will be disruptions to everybody. There is a certain degree of inevitability about that. We very much want to make sure that trainees are trained to the same standard, but obviously we've all got a responsibility to maintain patient safety. So I think those are the three guiding pillars that we are trying to adopt. We're moving to a competence-based curriculum in August 2021. And to some extent, our obsession with numbers does need to dissipate, and we do need to be more mindful about having trainees that are competent to undertake the procedures that they will be doing in their consultant practice. There will be flexibility at the minute across ARCPs as they are being delivered, and I'm aware of that because we're in ARCP season at the moment. And that flexibility will be delivered by the training program directors, who will be taking into account the trajectory of the trainees in their training. There are some key transition points where there are some minimal things that need to have been achieved, but otherwise there is a degree of flexibility around those ARCPs and assessing what the trajectory is of each individual trainee. I think, though, we need to be pragmatic. We need to accept that there's going to be a problem in terms of training, particularly in elective surgery, for almost certainly a year to come. So this will mean there may well be potentially less numbers of patients to operate on, although we're anticipating waiting lists moving, for example, into the elective, into the private sector. It is clear that it's not absolute plain sailing at the moment, having trainees operating or being lead operators in the private sector. But we also need to accept that the NHS inevitably will be less efficient. You've talked around PPE turnaround times, and we know that theatres will be less efficient, and hospitals are needing to divide themselves up into essentially COVID-free or COVID-light and COVID-heavy environments. I think I just finish my comments by saying we are trying to work very closely with JCST. We're trying to be realistic about what the expectations should be of trainees. We'll do our best to try to optimise that clinical learning and the operative environment for the trainees. But it is going to be a slog, I think, for the next year to keep that momentum and to keep the trainees doing elective surgical operating. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I think what we'll try and do is battle through some of the questions that have come up. We'll try and give answers where we can, and there may be some that we don't know the answer, but let's see how we get on. So clearly there's likely to be certain areas that will be much slower to recover than others. There's clearly going to be a lot of prioritisation in remobilising clinical services, so there may be impact in particular, whether it's subspecialty areas. The case mentioned is facial plastics, and some specialties within ENT, for example. Tim, how do you think, as a head of school and guiding TPDs, we should tackle particular areas that are going to be really challenged by being slow to be prioritised in the remobilisation plans?
So what we're doing at School of Surgery Perspective, and also discussed at COPS this afternoon, is that we are speaking with our TPDs across the specialties and trying to identify those elective procedures that are going to be undertaken at low volume or may even not be undertaken at all. These would be what they call the level 4 procedures in the list that FSSA and the specialty associations put together, which is very helpful. And then using that data, that almost real-time information that's coming back, we need to feed that back into JCST to speak with them and having some realistic expectations of what's going to be achieved within the curriculum, and potentially thinking about some areas of derogation or moving expectations for particular curricula into subsequent years. Another thing that's been spoken about is to try to have some local arrangements whereby if there's particular experience, maybe, for example, something like cleft and palate surgery, and the trainees not being exposed to it due to COVID, that there's potential to go back into a unit maybe for a 3 or 4 week period out of the next block to gain particular competencies or particular experience. I think it will come back to what I was saying before, which is flexibility on the part of the TPDs and the training programs, looking for bespoke, individualised solutions for individual trainees.
Excellent. So, Bill, if I can come to you, we've had a big fixation in surgery about numbers, and I think either David or yourself had mentioned this, and we are moving to outcomes, to competencies. Do you think we can be more flexible in where those numbers have come from? Again, one of the questions come up in the panel is, can we count activity that was done in core training or non-training posts? How do we capture that, or is it only the experience within training? And this perhaps touches on your gap analysis, but how do trainees that perhaps have a much broader experience reflect that?
This is part and parcel of our next piece of work. You've got that question about core skills. You've also got questions lower down from colleagues from the SAS grade. And the problem we have here is we've got to get some stuff, it's an agreement with the regulator. Because hitherto, as the correspondents are saying, that their skills have not been recognised when they've gone into training and feel that's unfair. We want to address that because there's no doubt that the amount of experience individuals are gaining in trust service provision, it should be, I think, recognisable. But we have to make sure that everybody is content with that because there's due process that needs to meet the requirements of the regulator. So the answer to the questions that are raised from those various correspondents is we are totally aware of the point you're making. At the moment, and the first piece of work has taken us a while to get to doing for the trainees. The next and possibly more difficult but bigger piece of work is looking for those who are trying to get skills that they've gained in trust service provision posts. What the generic professional capabilities do is they actually give us a mechanism for recording those skills so that people are practicing medicine, they are gaining professionally, they are developing. So why not recognize it? Now, there are some hoops we've got to go through. So what we are arguing is that individuals, whether they are in trust early years or in trust posts that have been in practice for a number of years, They should record the experience they have, and as you say, on an outcomes basis. Tim gave reference to the next iteration of the curriculum, which unfortunately due to COVID has been delayed till August next year. And the outcomes-based principles will be those 5 or 6, 7 or 8 things we do as consultants or doctors in surgery, week in, week out. We run an outpatient clinic, we run an operating list, etc. And the intention is to demonstrate that you are competent to complete those tasks. The evidence from your experience will go towards that assessment, and that's what we'll be looking for as we design the way in which the gap analysis works. So I can't say we can do it now, but we are just waiting. We think we're going to get the necessary support from the GMC, and we want to get that up and running in the next 12 months. There are some issues around SAS because there are contractual discussions ongoing as well in parallel, which make it slightly more difficult. But the points that are being made, rest assured, we're very conscious of that and are trying to address them. But it's keep a good, careful record. And it may be you need to sign up to a college portfolio or keep your own. You need to have one yourself because you'll need it for your appraisal process. And get your CPD with your goals for each year set. That will really put you in good stead if you want to join a training program.
Thanks, Bill. Really good practical advice. And I was just going to say, make sure everything is captured, recorded, and think of the generic things that you're doing, whether within training, out of training, whether redeployed. Many of the trainees are not working even in surgical disciplines, but you can still be capturing activity. So really practical advice.
And
Quite a few questions.
If I could just come in on that one, sorry to interrupt. The other key that's crucial nowadays is reflection. You need to think, am I doing the right thing, and what have I learned from this experience, and what would I do differently next time? We all do that somewhat probably instinctively as senior consultants, because that's what we've done to get to the way we've gone through our careers. But it's crucial that you indoctrinate that into your own mindset, because that's what makes you a professional.
Excellent. I'm going to turn to the question of simulation, because there's quite a few questions on can we compensate for some of the lack in clinical exposure by developing and using simulation. David, I don't know in terms of trauma and orthopedics, the relevance, the applicability, and also then to come to Tim in a minute and how we enhance the opportunities for simulation. But David, can simulation replace clinical cases in the logbook?
I think there are various types of simulation. You can have very simple simulation with manipulating sugar cubes in a box to simulate various aspects of laparoscopic surgery. And at the other extreme, then you can go to full cadaver-based simulation, doing an operation on a cadaver, so it's very difficult to come up, therefore, with any sort of generalizations in that area. I think the other thing that would certainly also concern me is that when you are doing a procedure in an operating theatre, you're not just learning the actual technical procedure, you're learning how to work as part of a team. And therefore you are wanting to, you're practicing non-technical skills, decision-making and communication. And these aren't things that are necessarily come out in the simulation environment. So yes, simulation will capture some of it, but I think if you put that into a logbook and say, well, a simulated total hip replacement on a cadaver is the same as doing it on a real live person, you aren't capturing all of the, necessarily anyway, capturing all of the experience that you would get. And it certainly, you could maybe make a mathematical trade-off and say 3 in a cadaver is worth 1 in real life. In theory, there is certainly some, but it's not a perfect substitute.
Absolutely. Tim, any thoughts from a head of school and where we're going with simulation for surgical training?
Well, again, thank you very much. To some extent, in agreement with David, but maybe just another couple of points. Simulation is important. It's part of improving surgical training. It's one of the building blocks of IST, and who can argue with improving surgical training. But simulation is about about the building bricks, the building blocks of surgery. It's about building competence. It's about building certain procedural or technical skills. So it all contributes towards that. And in fact, surgical simulation is everything except being in the operating theatre doing the operation. You can have a simulation walking down the corridor, talking to the boss about how you are going to do the next operation. You'll recall that that's how some elite sports people take themselves through the next ski run. So simulation is important, but it's a series of building blocks. It is an important part of all HEE regions activities and is usually part of the investment in study leave. We do cadaveric surgical training, but I think we need to be realistic, and cadaveric operative surgical training, that degree of simulation is going to be unlikely for a while and certainly wouldn't be restarted, we think, until the universities permit it and into next year. So thank you.
Thanks both. Gregory, I'm going to come to you again as a trainee. You've been listening, reflecting on some of this. No doubt you've got other questions, but do you want to fire anything at the panel?
Yeah, a few things. So agree with the panel. Simulation is important, doesn't replace surgical experience, but augments it quite well. And I think it should be promoted both now and moving forward. Tim and others on the panel have made the point about our obsession with numbers and the curriculum changing in 2021. However, there will be those trainees that are caught in between, i.e. this is your final year, and where the numbers is still fairly crucial for them. The question to you, Tim, from a CUPS point of view, with a controversial hat on, if I said, is there an opportunity to prioritize senior trainees in certain procedures who are coming towards the end of your training over more junior trainees, as we referenced to earlier, who have a bit more time to achieve both the competency but also the numbers? What would the view of COPS be to that?
Well, I can give you my own opinion as head of school and as being a surgical trainer for many years. I think we've been actually doing that for many years, and it would obviously be the logical thing to do. I think we do need to prioritise surgical trainees, and those that are approaching CCT, or what I'd call the pinch points or transition points, these should be the trainees that are prioritised. If you think about it, when we're doing placements, we will try to put the right trainee with the right trainer at the right time in their training, certainly in any programme worth its salt. That would be the intention. So putting the right seed in the right soil. I don't see that as being contentious at all. You have to put the trainees in the right environment to give them the best chance at being able to achieve their CCT.
If I may, Rowan, just to comment on that, that is actually the issue around, yes, we've had this issue about numbers. But there's the ability to be competent to do something, but you got to have the experience to maintain that competence in the more difficult cases. The whole point about the out of program pause is to do exactly that, in that you're there to consolidate experience where it may have been a bit thin in certain areas. And that's what's being promoted by HEE from this August. And I think going forward, once we get back to the new normal, then particularly in surgery where there is a potential problem where something, as David showed you with reduction in numbers, the opportunity to take a time out to go and work in a more of a service provision situation where usually you will be in parallel to the trainees. The opportunity to get that experience and to boost the logbook and the general confidence is what this whole process that I've talked about is intended to do.
Yeah, quickly.
Rowan, can I come back to you? Sorry, I have a second bite of the cherry. Thank you for the question, Greg. I think really we're doing a lot of talking about the trainees, but actually we should talk a little bit about the trainers. It's about incentivizing them, encouraging them, getting them to maintain a degree of momentum with surgical training. Some of that momentum has been taken out of the system. And it's about, to some extent, supporting excellence in surgical training. It is a Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh webinar, and I think we need to remember that the Faculty of Surgical Trainers sits within the College of Surgeons, and that purports to both develop standards and put forward excellence in surgical trainers. So I think we should be pushing the trainers really here, Greg, to deliver now.
I would entirely agree.
Absolutely. I think trainers have a huge part to play, and I've been really encouraged by some of the questions and comments in the chat box have been from trainers looking at ways that they can do innovative things, use the training capacity that they have, looking for opportunities of doing other non-technical things, but, broadening and giving opportunities for quality improvement projects, audits, etc., like that. GPCs can be delivered, and many of those can be recorded, captured during this time where there's perhaps less operating. So I think, as Tim has highlighted, trainers have a big part, as our Faculty of Surgical Trainers is clearly one way to network and think about these things and to develop them. Gregory, have you anything else you want to add?
Just going through the questions, so nothing specifically from me. I think we've covered most of the points around SAS and trust doctors, as well as getting your training from other opportunities recognised, and I think that's been well covered.
Okay, so one of the questions earlier on might have been answered in the chat box was, should we be changing the current CCT targets and, if you like, rebaselining what's needed for CCT? Tim, at the start you mentioned one of the things we didn't want to do was change standards, but perhaps is there another way of looking at this and, move away from the fixation on numbers of cases to something perhaps broader or different? Have you any thoughts on that, Tim?
I have, and I need to just sort of be slightly mindful of what I say, but I think if you think about what we're trying to do, we're trying to train consultant surgeons to work in the NHS. And the NHS really is moving, it's changing under our feet. And so although we are due to have new curriculum coming in 2021, it may be what we're trying to train our current surgical trainees to do is not what is necessarily going to be required over the next few years. So I do think we need to have a real-time look at actually what the demand is in the NHS within each of the surgical services, and be realistic with the surgical curricula and be prepared to be bold and say, well, some trainee, that area of surgery is not going to be performed to the same amount. We do not need all the surgical trainees to have got that surgical experience, to achieve those competencies and be realistic about it, and potentially alter our expectations for CCT accordingly. Clearly, there'll also be implications for the examination with that as well, but they're flexible and they're considering that. And then if trainees do wish to move into certain areas of specialisation post-CCT, again, we need to be flexible about those areas which we may be credentialing in a post-CCT environment. A little bit like we've been flexible about TIGs over the years and identifying that there are certain areas of surgical practice which to some extent may fall between specialties, and there's been a move there to accommodate that and move to that requirement for a CCT. But that's about moving towards what the demand is in the NHS.
Okay.
Right.
I'm conscious that we've run 1 hour. I'm going to ask Bill or David if they have any final comments, and then going to leave the very last word to Gregory. But, it's been a fantastic session. We've tried to answer, and grateful to the panel for answering almost 30 questions, as well as what we've brought up in discussion. But, Bill, any thoughts?
Yeah, I completely endorse what Tim said. We have to look at what the service needs. But one of the other things that we are developing in the context of flexibility is there's no doubt that trainees currently wish to look at the longer term of what their job looks like. And we're looking now at developing, taking a leaf out of the physician book of so-called portfolio training, whereby you will have your clinical commitment, but equally you can have a post where, say, you do 7 or 8 sessions of clinical work, but the other 2 or 3 sessions are dedicated to something different. That could be management, it could be research, it could be something else. And I think this allows getting away from the treadmill of having to completely do all the service time all the time through. And it means that we can develop a different skill set, which I think will be popular, not only with trainees as they go into consultant practice, but actually to employers, because I think you'll have a more interesting as well as interested working time and workforce. So that's a plan that's on the table and moving forward to get this diversity of what you do as a consultant.
Yeah, very thoughtful, Bill. Thank you. David, you set the tone at the start, showing what some of the challenges are. I think over the last hour we've discussed a lot of opportunities, flexibility, a real commitment to support trainees. You finished your presentation on a note of optimism. Have you anything else to comment before we wind up?
Well, no, except to say that it is perhaps wrong to have started off with me, which showed that I have an unhealthy obsession with numbers, when it clearly is much more than numbers that actually make a good surgeon. And I hope I've borne that out in some of the comments that I've made. So, but I do feel, well, certainly if we were to return to normal, and I think the answer to that is probably we won't, or certainly won't return to where we were, then clearly it is, I perceive it as being something that is fairly recoverable, but maybe that was undue optimism. We'll just have to wait and see.
I think there's a lot of us will be waiting to see. Let's wind up there. I'm extremely grateful, David, Bill, Tim, Gregory, for all your input. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for the presentations, and also to all who've tuned in and the questions. We've tried to answer as many. Some of them are challenging, some of them will be difficult, but as we move through this COVID experience, I'm certain that there's many people wanting to do what's very best for the trainees. There's a lot of really good trainers out there that want to get things back on track, and we have to remember that as we move forward in the coming weeks at months. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and again, don't forget to tune in next Monday to the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, 7 o'clock in the evening webinar series. So good evening, and thanks to all.
Thank you.